They laughed at first, to the captured German prisoners. The Soviet Katyusha was nothing more than a crude display, a bundle of pipes strapped to a truck, a carnival trick compared to the refined engineering of the vaunted 88mm guns of the Wehrmacht. In their minds, precision was the measure of mastery, and no army on earth could match the sharp accuracy of German artillery. To mock the Katyusha was to reassure themselves that German science still reigned supreme, even as the war shifted against them. In the barracks of American camps in 1945, stories spilled out between rations and card games. Young officers smirked when they described their first encounters, recalling how the launchers looked like little more than plumbing tubes welded in haste. "It's nothing," one POW scoffed, his voice echoing with a mix of arrogance and denial. "A firework display for peasants." The others laughed, remembering how they had once dismissed it in the field with the same contempt. But behind those laughs lingered unease, because they all knew how quickly that confidence had collapsed. The contrast could not have been sharper. The German 88s were their pride weapons that could hit a tank at over 2 kilometers, shells arcing with surgical precision, crews trained with obsessive discipline, polishing the barrels until they gleamed, their officers lecturing that each round fired was the equivalent of a scalpel cut. To be part of such a machine was to believe in the invincibility of German science, an illusion nurtured on every front. When word of the Katyusha spread in 1941, most saw it as proof of Soviet desperation, a weapon for shock rather than skill. What none of them admitted aloud was the memory that never left them. The first sound, not the explosion, not the impact, but the shriek of ignition, a chorus of pipes screaming together, carrying across the battlefield like a banshee wail. For the Germans, who had built their pride on order and predictability, this chaos was unimaginable. That sound, dismissed at first as crude noise, grew into something far more terrifying. It was not science, not accuracy, not elegance. It was fear itself, given voice. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And as you watch, share your location and local time in the comments below. Somewhere tonight, someone else may be listening to the story under the same dark sky. In the days before the Katyusha scream filled their nightmares, German prisoners had lived wrapped in their faith in science. Around campfires in 1941, soldiers bragged about the weapons that made them proud to wear the uniform of the Reich. None stood taller in their imagination than the 88mm gun. Its reputation had already spread across Europe, feared by tank crews, cursed by Allied pilots, admired even by enemies who tasted its precision. To the Germans, this was not merely artillery. It was proof that German engineering represented the pinnacle of civilization itself. Inside the barracks, years later, POWs clung to this memory. One recalled how his sergeant compared each shot of the 88 to a surgeon's knife, slicing the battlefield with exact cuts. "We never wasted a round," he whispered, more to himself than to others. Another spoke of how the crews cleaned and polished the barrels as if they were sacred relics. Even in the mud of the Eastern Front, they believed that discipline and precision would win them the war, that numbers and chaos could never defeat skill and order. This pride was not born in the trenches alone. In factories across Germany, engineers celebrated the 88 as the weapon that blurred the line between art and science. It was versatile, serving as both anti-air and anti-tank, a masterpiece of technical evolution. Over 21,000 of these guns were produced during the war, each one representing hours of meticulous labor, each one reinforcing the myth of German superiority. Soldiers who manned them felt they carried not just steel, but the very symbol of the Reich's destiny. But destiny is a fragile word. What happens when confidence becomes a cage, blinding men to what lies beyond the POWs? Sipping weak coffee in American camps, argued late into the night about the day their pride cracked. Some insisted the 88 was still unmatched, that the Soviet rockets were merely brute force. Others fell silent, unable to push away the memory of Earth trembling beneath them. Pride, once shouted from trenches and parade grounds, now lived only as a bitter aftertaste. The arrogance of science had set the stage. The higher they lifted themselves, the further they would fall when the first rockets screamed across the sky. In that silence, when laughter in the barracks died, each man knew that his proudest boast had become his deepest shame. It began not with destruction, but with a sound that clawed its way into the bones of every man who heard it. The first ignition of a Katyusha battery was unlike anything the Germans had encountered before. They were used to the sharp, disciplined crack of rifles, the thunder of well-timed artillery barrages, even the distant hum of bombers approaching overhead. But this was different. It was a howl that seemed to come from the earth itself, a collective roar of dozens of launch tubes spitting fire into the night at once. Soldiers in the trenches remembered how time seemed to slow in that instant. In the summer of 1941 near Orsha, German units reported hearing the first launches before they saw the fire. It was like the sky tearing open. One later wrote in a confiscated diary, smuggled into the archives, "We froze, and no one spoke." The noise was not human. It was as though the devil himself had found a voice. The music of destruction carried far beyond the front line. Entire villages, miles behind the battlefield, heard the eerie chorus echo across the fields, mothers clutching their children as the ground trembled. Soviet soldiers nicknamed the weapon Stalin's organ, not only for its pipe-like appearance, but for the way its shrieks mimicked the thunder of a twisted cathedral organ. For those on the receiving end, the name felt grimly appropriate, as if some higher power had rewritten the music of war into a hymn of terror. Even seasoned officers, veterans of Poland and France, found themselves stunned. They had faced artillery before, but nothing that spoke in such numbers all at once. Dozens of projectiles lifting into the air simultaneously created not just a threat, but a symphony of fear. Some tried to measure its pattern, counting seconds between ignition and impact. Yet their voices always faltered. How do you measure a weapon designed not to be understood, but to overwhelm? In the POW camps, years later, one German lieutenant admitted in hushed tones that the very first rocket salvo shattered his faith in precision. It was not about aim. He muttered, it was about sound. The sound killed before the rockets ever landed. His fellow prisoners fell quiet at those words, each returning in memory to that first unholy scream that erased laughter and left only dread. The ignition of Katyusha was more than the beginning of a rocket launch. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare, where fear itself became a weapon, where the sky's voice was enough to paralyze men who once trusted only in steel and order. The night sky burned when the first salvos of Katyusha rockets cut across the darkness. It was not a battlefield in the ordinary sense. It was an apocalypse staged by human hands. Witnesses spoke of dozens of crimson arcs streaking overhead, their trails painting the heavens as though someone had set fire to the stars themselves. The earth shuddered beneath boots, trenches convulsed, and entire forests seemed to quiver as the rockets slammed into the soil in waves, for German soldiers who had mocked the weapon as little more than fireworks. The sight was nothing less than a revelation of terror. At Smolensk, in July 1941, regiments who had expected to advance through orderly lines of defense suddenly faced chaos. Katyusha batteries fired up to 16 rockets at once, each nearly 2 meters long, each weighing over 40 kilograms, within seconds. The blasts carved into the earth with fireballs larger than houses, scattering soil, timber, and bodies alike. A Wehrmacht corporal captured months later recalled in his journal how the ground rolled like waves at sea under the impacts, as if the earth itself wanted to throw them off its back. Soviet soldiers, too, were stunned by what they had unleashed. Gunners described how the trucks carrying Katyusha launchers rocked under the force of firing, engines rattling, crews covering their ears as the scream deafened them. Many lost hearing temporarily after a salvo. Yet in the aftermath, silence on their side was filled only with awe. Where once they had watched the German war machine with fear, now they saw enemies stumbling, running, abandoning helmets and rifles as if chased by demons. For the Germans, the spectacle demolished illusions of superiority. Their beloved 88s seemed like precision rifles compared to this storm, but rifles cannot fight hurricanes. Officers trying to rally their men found words useless. The rockets did not just destroy positions, they destroyed discipline itself. Even units not directly hit by the barrage were thrown into confusion, their senses overwhelmed by the thunder of explosions echoing across kilometers of front line. Years later, POWs described that first true barrage as the moment they realized the war would never again be fought on familiar terms. The Katyusha was not an artillery piece to be measured and countered. It was an event, a calamity, a force of nature disguised as steel. One prisoner muttered in an American camp that he could still see the red sky over Russia every time he closed his eyes. The laughter about fireworks had long since died. The rockets left behind not just craters, but a psychological scar that never healed. The Germans had entered the East, believing their science made them masters. On that night, under a sky turned blood red, they discovered that fear could be engineered just as effectively as any machine. It did not take long for the fear to spread faster than the rockets themselves. By the winter of 1941, whole German companies had learned to dread not the impact of Katyusha fire, but the sound of its approach. The whistle that rose across the tree line was enough to unhinge even veteran soldiers. In official reports, commanders noted how men abandoned dugouts before the first explosions, fleeing blindly into the night simply to escape the shriek that clawed at their nerves. Statistics reveal the scale of this panic. Soviet archives record that during major offensives, a single Katyusha battery could fire 320 rockets in less than 10 minutes, saturating up to 4 square kilometers of land. German intelligence estimated that 70% of soldiers caught in such barrages were not wounded by fragments at all, but by sheer disorganization, men scattering, communications severed, units breaking apart in chaos. In the War of Steel, terror had become a force multiplier. Inside POW camps in 1945, these memories resurfaced with painful clarity. One sergeant told fellow prisoners that he could still hear the scream of Katyusha in his sleep. Decades later, "I never feared our enemy's tanks, not even their planes," he admitted softly. But when that sound began, my legs moved before my brain could think. Another recounted how an entire platoon ran from trenches near Bryansk at the first whistle, only to discover the rockets were aimed miles away. The sound alone had routed them. The gossip in the barracks grew darker. Some prisoners argued that the Katyusha was not even a proper weapon, that it lacked refinement. Others whispered that perhaps its very lack of precision was the point. It aimed at our minds. One officer muttered, staring at his tin cup, "Not at our positions." There were arguments that lasted for hours. Men who had once boasted about the exact cuts of the 88, now reduced to debating how terror itself could be manufactured. And here, dear listener, is where I ask you, what do you think? Was the Katyusha a crude instrument of chaos, or a stroke of genius in psychological warfare? Share your thoughts in the comments, because history is not only about numbers, but about how we interpret fear itself. For the men who once laughed at pipes on a truck, the answer had already been written in the echoes of their flight. They had run not from steel, but from sound. And sound leaves scars no surgeon's scalpel can mend. In time, the laughter of arrogance gave way to the quiet bitterness of recognition. Prisoners of war who once scoffed at the crude Soviet launchers admitted, sometimes reluctantly, that the Katyusha had carved its place in history not through accuracy, but through terror. It was a weapon designed to sow despair. Precision belonged to the German 88, but despair belonged to the rockets that screamed from the horizon. Letters preserved in Soviet archives tell the other half of this story. One factory worker from Voronezh described fainting at her machine after a 16-hour shift assembling rocket parts, yet rising again at the call of her foreman, because she knew the front depended on it. Another diary from a Red Army gunner recalls bleeding from his ears after a salvo, his hearing lost for days, yet he continued loading tubes into the rails with trembling hands. The Katyusha demanded sacrifice from both sides, fear in the enemy, exhaustion in those who carried its burden. In the camps, POWs compared memories, sometimes in whispers late at night. An artillery officer who had prided himself on charts and angles admitted that his calculations had become meaningless when the rockets fell. They struck nothing in particular, he told his companions, yet they struck everything inside us. It was a confession that hung in the air, too bitter to debate, even years after the front had collapsed. The echoes lingered. Soldiers could forget the exact shape of tanks or the sound of small arms fire, but the shriek of Katyusha never left them, a sound not of steel, but of despair given voice. For the Germans, it marked the moment when war ceased to be about discipline and became a struggle of nerves. And you, listening now, imagine standing in a trench, the air trembling with that unearthly wail. Would you have held your ground, or would your instincts have betrayed you, sending you running into the dark? Tell me in the comments below. These are not just stories of weapons, but but questions about what it means to be human when fear itself becomes the battlefield. For the POWs, the Katyusha's legacy was not in the craters it left behind, but in the silence that followed, silence heavy with the realization that a weapon need not be precise to win. It only had to reach the heart. Decades passed, yet the memory clung like smoke that refused to disperse. For many former German prisoners, the war faded into fragments, the endless mud of the Eastern Front, the cold rations of the camps, the silent faces of men who never returned. Tanks and rifles blurred together in recollection, but one detail never softened, never grew distant. It was the sound. The scream of the Katyusha remained as vivid as the night it first shattered their confidence. In American camps after 1945, veterans of those battles sometimes fell silent when the topic arose. One colonel, who had once bragged of the 88mm gun, was seen shaking his head, unable to continue when another prisoner mentioned the rockets. Others, after years of captivity, admitted in private conversations that they could no longer remember exact battles or dates, only the sensation of being swallowed by a sky that howled like a living creature. That sound had become their battlefield, more real than any trench map or order of battle. The weapon itself changed with time. Hundreds of thousands of rockets were produced before the war's end, mounted on trucks, tanks, even river barges. It became a symbol of Soviet resilience, a crude yet unstoppable chorus that announced offensives from Kursk to Berlin. Abandoned Katyusha launchers littered fields when the front shifted, their pipes rusting under the rain, for villagers who found them. These relics looked lifeless, mere scrap, yet for those who had once faced them, the silence around these relics was haunted by echoes only they could hear. One POW later confessed that, when walking through a quiet American town after his release, he froze at the whistle of a distant factory steam pipe. He said it was as if the years had fallen away and the rockets were again arching overhead. He admitted he felt ashamed of his body's instinctive reaction, but also powerless to erase it. Fear had etched itself too deeply. The story of the Katyusha was not about steel alone. It was about transformation, the journey from ridicule to silence, from mockery to awe. What began as laughter in the barracks of the Wehrmacht ended as a memory that bound prisoners in decades of uneasy reflection. The battlefield had moved on, but the sound remained. Imagine now a single Katyusha launcher, abandoned in a meadow, its tubes corroded, grass growing tall around its wheels. The wind slips through the hollow pipes and carries a low whistle across the empty field. To strangers, it is just the breeze, but to those who remember, it is the voice of history itself, the sky screaming once more. Even in peace, history has a way of leaving behind more than ruins and monuments. It leaves echoes, sounds that linger long after the guns fall silent. For the German prisoners who once mocked the Katyusha as little more than pipes on a truck, that echo became the sound of their own undoing. They had entered the war believing that precision defined victory, that steel and calculation would decide the fate of nations. Yet what they carried into old age was not the memory of shells striking true, but of rockets shrieking across a blood-red sky. The Katyusha was not elegant, not refined, not even accurate by conventional standards. It was crude, rushed into production, and costly in the labor it demanded of exhausted Soviet workers, but in its imperfection lay its genius. It showed that war is not only fought with machines, but with the mind, a weapon that could shatter nerves, break formations, and turn discipline into chaos, proved more devastating than the sharpest scalpel of German science. For decades after the war, survivors spoke less of battles won or lost than of the sounds that haunted them. Even in the quiet of American towns or German villages, a distant whistle could summon back the terror of 1941. Memory is a strange battlefield, where fear is never entirely buried. Perhaps that is why the Katyusha endures as more than a relic. It is a reminder that technology does not simply destroy, it transforms human experience. It shapes what men believe, what they fear, and what they remember. Standing before a rusted launcher today, one might hear only silence. Yet in that silence lies a history of screams, a testament to the fragility of human certainty, and to the power of sound to wound the soul as deeply as steel.